Welcome this evening. My name is Craig Broman. I work for City Bible Forum, State Director, and it's a national workplace mission which is in every mainland capital city in Australia, and it's made up of workers and people in business who are convinced that Jesus Christ is relevant to contemporary society in a place like Adelaide, and particularly in the workplace. So thank you so much for taking time to come out tonight. It's officially the end of the Fringe Festival, but we just managed to, whip this one in on the Tuesday afterwards. And it's a public discussion tonight of the resurrection recorded in the New Testament. It's great to do this. My vision, or our vision at City Bible Forum for a number of years now, was to try and do a public forum in the centre of the city in the lead up to Easter, where we could model, I suppose, what we see going on in the New Testament when the early Christians went out into their cities and were not afraid to be in the public spaces where people discussed the big issues of life. And that's certainly what our mandate is, to encourage people to ask those bigger questions in life. And tonight's question is the resurrection a fairy tale, fact or fiction? And that would arguably be one of the bigger questions to ask in life, and no better time to ask it than in the lead up to having 4 public holidays, which we call Easter. Now, although we do interesting events other than this as an organisation, this one has created incredible interest and popularity. We were sold out a week ago, and we've had a waiting list of 25 people that we've been magically trying to squeeze in with occupational health and safety issues. So why is an event like this so popular tonight? Well, I think probably because we have been at pains to create a very level playing field for a discussion this evening. We want to hear both sides of the story, and at every stage I think we've tried to work out how to be fair and even-handed in the way that we have this discussion tonight, for you to watch and also participate in. So tonight, if you hear a bell at some particular point, that's because we're trying to be fair. So we'll tell the person who's speaking that they've got 1 minute left before they need to wrap up their particular presentation. Tonight you'll hear from 2 experts on why they think that the resurrection has a historical basis, and then one on why they think that the resurrection doesn't have an historical basis. Then we're going to set some members of the legal fraternity loose, probing and clarifying and asking questions by those people who have presented for the night. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions via SMS text, and then we'll take a break and we'll collect those questions together, and then your questions will be put to the experts tonight who have presented. And then the lawyers will come back and they'll make some closing comments towards the end of the night. So who are the lawyers? Well, for the resurrection tonight, we have Andrew Schatz. He appears as a solicitor advocate in courts and tribunals. He's an experienced presenter. He's published in Lawyers Weekly, and he runs all the way from West Lakes into the city in the morning to go to work. I hope he's got showers there. Anyway, for the resurrection tonight, we have Gabby Jackson. Gabby is a commercial lawyer who has been working for the government for just shy of 25 years. Now, prior to this, he had a much shorter period where he was a very enthusiastic altar boy, and he loved ringing bells. So now, after sober reflection, he's an atheist and who has never lost his fascination for philosophy, physics and mathematics. So could you put your hands together for these lawyers who have given up their time tonight? Thanks. Now, moderating tonight's event is John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister, farmer, businessman, international speaker. He is an inspiring leader. He's been around Adelaide for the last week, speaking at a number of breakfasts on all sorts of subjects of leadership and integrity in business. He is quite a prophetic voice when it comes to speaking about our country, and where it's heading, and I guess from the position of no longer being in the cut and thrust of politics can actually reflect quite well on what we look like as a country and where we're heading. He uses integrity, and that's the reason why we wanted him to moderate an event like tonight, and he is a genuinely decent Australian. So could you please welcome him? So, John, what have you been doing since Canberra days?
Well, I'm a sixth-generation farmer in northwest New South Wales, and I've essentially gone back to farming with my family, although I do a number of not-for-profit causes. I chair one or two, one's secular, one's Christian, do some public speaking and do some advising, but limited in the corporate sector. I don't think I have much to offer them, and they probably don't think I have much to offer them either. But I've been surprised actually at how busy life post-Canberra actually is. We've just had, though, my wife and I, in between events in Melbourne and here, a weekend in the Adelaide Hills. Love the state. We honeymooned here 28 years ago. So to get out and around Harndorf and then up into the Barossa again, this is I'm not saying it because I'm here. It's a lovely state, I'm sure, if you live here. It's certainly a great state to visit.
Great. And what is one of your passions that you visited while you were here?
That's a leading question. I'm a car nut, and so I went to the Birdwood Museum 28 years ago and went again over the weekend, spent hours there, thoroughly enjoyed it. I must say I'm really deeply saddened. We rented an SV6 Holden Commodore made here in South Australia, and it's a genuinely world-class car, and I'm genuinely sorry that the Australian industry its days are drawing to a close. We all know why, but it's still a source of great sadness to me personally.
John, can you tell us what was your interest in taking part in a night like this, talking about the resurrection?
Well, you asked me so nicely.
Apart from that.
Well, firstly, I think I'd say to you, I enjoy a good debate, a good discussion. I think it's incredibly important. I have a slight advantage over all of you in this room. I saw some incredible research last year. I was asked by the current government to be part of a very small panel, along with another South Australian and someone from Canberra, to make some recommendations to the Prime Minister on this issue of how we might recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution. And we had unfettered access to all of the political researchers, and they're very bright, I can tell you, and they know what you think. It's almost Big Brother stuff. It's extraordinary how they can tap into and learn how you're thinking as Australians. And one of the things that really struck me was that Australians are in a really dark frame of mind about the public debate today. They get it, that it's descended into a bad place, and it's not just the politicians. We don't talk to one another in a civil way anymore. We substitute personal attack often for debating the evidence. And I recall that... how long do you want me to go on for? I've got quite a lot I'd like to say. But, you know,
the lecturer has now arrived, so we can.
That's handy. But there are a couple of points I'd like to make since I'm emceeing tonight. Voltaire, it's often attributed to Voltaire that he supposedly said, "I may disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Okay? Now, Voltaire didn't actually say that. His lady biographer said it in seeking to summarise his views. But it's an important, I think, little reminder. He was plainly recognising two things that are really important. Firstly, everyone has a right to their say and to their opinions. Freedom of conscience and freedom of expression are the most basic freedoms that any of us have in a civil society. The second thing he's plainly saying is that the other person is worthy of respect. They should be not only allowed to put their idea on the table, but we should then move to debate that idea, not denigrate the other person. And the research shows us very plainly many Australians now feel intimidated from putting their views on the table because they don't think their view will be discussed, they think they'll be attacked. I think that is a great tragedy. Voltaire recognised, we need to recognise, we'll get the best policy, the best public outcomes every time we have a genuine debate about the idea that's on the table. Secondly, ideas are incredibly powerful. Our societies have been shaped by ideas. And plainly, Western society has been massively shaped by Christian influence. That's really a matter of history, whether you believe or not. And can I say to you that I actually think in the world that we now live in, the reality is this is not going to be a secular age. In fact, the reality is that it's not a secular age. Globally, this is an age of enormous religious ferment, regardless of how we might feel about it. And in terms of sheer numbers, you're seeing an explosion in religious activity. I heard the other day from an impeccable source, if I put it that way. Never trust a politician when I say that, but I'm an ex-politician.
You are an
right? I'm an ex-politician. That Beijing now believes there are 160 million committed Christians in China, and that it'll grow to 250 by the middle of this century. On the other end of the scale, so to speak, in terms of observing what's happening in terms of religious fervour around the world, there's now an enormous focus on what Muslims believe and what motivates Muslims. So this will be an age of great religious ferment. I want to say to you, I profoundly believe that we need to understand again what lies behind these great belief systems and how they impact on people, whether we choose to believe or not. In addition to that, then I should say to you, I need to fess up, don't I? For me, this is a profoundly important debate. If it's true, I can't think of anything that could matter more than the idea that God walked amongst us and was resurrected. If it's not, no one's to be more pitied than people like me and you, old chap, and all of those believers down through the ages, who have given up goodness only knows what out of the power of the beliefs that struck deeply in their hearts. So those are some of the reasons that I think that this is a very important debate here tonight.
All right, well, I might hand it over to you and let the games begin, so to speak.
So, look, I think it's terrific that you've come out, wherever you stand on the spectrum tonight. I'm fascinated by what people have to say, and I hope you are as well, and I hope that it's a genuinely informative night for you. And wherever you come from in terms of that spectrum of beliefs, I hope that you'll feel free to think through the challenging remarks and comments and so forth that have been put before you. So, here we are in the State Library, another beautiful building in a city full of beautiful buildings. What better place to try and decide whether the issue of the resurrection and the story surrounding it should be filed under fact or under fiction. And I'd like to begin now by introducing the first of our two speakers, Dr. Chris Forbes, Senior Lecturer, Department of Ancient History, Macquarie University. I'll listen very intently. My youngest daughter is at your university studying history. There you go. I need to declare all potential conflicts of interest and so forth. But Dr. Chris Forbes is also the Deputy Chairman of the Society for the Study of Early Christianity. His fields of research and teaching focus on New Testament history, Alexander the Great and Hellenistic history, Graeco-Roman history of ideas, and the intersection of early Christianity and Greco-Roman culture. His current research is in the field of the relationship between religion and philosophy and Greco-Roman thought. He has taught at Macquarie in various positions since 1985 and was appointed Senior Lecturer in 2001. Will you please give a warm welcome to the first speaker tonight?
Thank you very much, and may I say what a pleasure it is for the first time in my academic career to be part of the Adelaide Fringe Festival. Don't think I was expecting that, but still. I'll come straight to the point. I have 6 basic points that I wish to make. Some of them are, or at least I think should be, uncontroversial. Others are not. I will not be able to deal with all the details in this first presentation, but we can take up the details of the controversial issues in the cross-examination sessions and the question times. Now, hardly anyone comes to this topic without biases, and I certainly do not. I should put my cards on the table. Personally, I'm a committed Christian. But professionally, I am also a committed ancient historian, and I teach subjects that do and subjects that do not have to do with early Christianity. And I aim to use precisely the same historical methods in each. It's my intention this evening to use only arguments based on historical evidence which could be accepted or argued with by people regardless of their personal religious convictions. I may or may not succeed, and you will be the judges of that, and that's as it should be. It's probably not possible for anyone to be objective, particularly on a topic like ours tonight, but it is certainly possible to be open about one's biases, self-critical, and open to the views and arguments of others. Claim number one, probably uncontroversial. The earliest clear evidence for the details of belief about the resurrection of Jesus is derived from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7, written around about 55 AD, and this report in 1 Corinthians appears to go back to an original report from before 40 AD. It's understandable when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus that people think first of the Gospels, but in fact the earliest known Christian documents are the letters of St. Paul, written between, at the very earliest, 48 AD and into the late 50s or early 60s AD, and the resurrection of Jesus is taken for granted in those letters. The most detailed discussion, and the only one which provides us with historically useful information of how early Christians argued for this belief, is in 1 Corinthians 15, as I said, written about 55 AD, and the longer discussion which follows in chapter 15. And here you have the passage. And I've put Paul's introduction and tailpiece in grey text and what he's actually quoting in bright white text. What Paul says is this: I handed on to you, Corinthians, as of first importance, that what I had in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, which is simply Aramaic for Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And then Paul's tailpiece, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, for reasons we can go into later if we need to, historians are confident that Paul originally preached in Corinth in mid to late 51 AD. In other words, he handed on to them what he then reports in the letter, circa mid to late 51 AD. But when did he receive it? And I think the only clear evidence we have is that he received it during his first visit to Jerusalem after he became a Christian, reported in Galatians 1:18, where he says, as it says here, then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that's Peter again, and stayed with him for 15 days. Now that, for reasons again we can talk about if we want to afterwards, that report clearly must have come to Paul before 40 AD, that is to say, less than 10 years after the claimed events. What I'm claiming, and I think this should be historically uncontroversial, is that this is the earliest evidence, considerably earlier than the Gospels, and must be considered historically primary, and it reports the shared view of both Paul and the Jerusalem apostles less than 10 years after the events that we're discussing. So that's claim number one. Claim number two, probably also uncontroversial. The later narrative evidence for the resurrection belief in the canonical Gospels dates from between about 35 and 65 years after the presumed events. And just for the record, historically, the execution of Jesus took place in April of either 30 or 33 AD, and historians can't make up their mind which. And again, if you're really interested in that kind of detail, we could talk about that later. Now, Dating the composition of the Gospels is not an exact science, but the great majority of scholars would agree that Mark was the first Gospel written and that it was written either slightly before or a little after 70 AD. And we can talk about the reasons for that as well, if you want to. After that, not quite sure how much after that, came Matthew and Luke, which were aware of and partly dependent on Mark, but had other sources of information as well. We probably cannot know which of Matthew and Luke wrote first, and it is very likely that they wrote independently, somewhere in the mid-70s, perhaps into the mid-80s AD. Finally, it's normally argued that John's Gospel was written last, probably somewhere in the 90s AD, and there's a highly controversial debate among scholars whether he was aware of the other three. He may have been, but it's not decided. Whether he was or not, it is clear that he had other sources of information of his own as well. Claim 3, and now things are likely to be more controversial. In terms of first, the date of writing of the Gospels, and second, the ancient manuscripts attesting to those writings, we actually have better historical evidence for the broad outline of Jesus' career than we have for most other historical figures from the ancient world. And I want to give you simply a working example now by comparing the sources we have in the Gospels for Jesus with the sources that we have for King Alexander the Great of Macedon, famous for one of the greatest marches of conquest the ancient world ever saw. Now, I'm choosing this example, A, because I teach Alexander and I know the details, and B, because though it's not a perfect parallel, it's a striking one. And it's a striking one because in both the case of Jesus and the Gospels and the case of the sources for Alexander the Great, we have 4 major sources of information which have some material in common. That's the 4 canonical Gospels for Jesus, and for Alexander, it's Diodorus Siculus, Quintus Curtius Rufus, Plutarch, and Arrian. In both cases, there's a strong argument that these sources used earlier sources of information, including eyewitnesses, both the Gospels and the sources for Alexander, though in both cases it's hard to check the details because those eyewitness sources no longer exist. Now, here we have a quick diagram showing you, number one, that Alexander the Great lived between 356 and 322 BC, and that we know that there were eyewitnesses. We know the names of several of them, Ptolemy, Aristobulus, and a number of others, who wrote in the period immediately after Alexander's death, i.e. within eyewitness range. But none of those sources have survived from the ancient world, except in later quotations by later writers. To get a proper narrative account of Alexander's career, you have to wait until the writings of Diodorus of Sicily, writing in the 30s BC. In other words, approximately 300 years after the events. Why don't I stand down? That'll give rather more of you a chance to see the diagram better. Then you have to wait another period before Quintus Curtius Rufus writes somewhere in the mid-1st century AD. In other words, around about 400 years after the events. Then we have Plutarch's Life of Alexander, written perhaps 120 AD, call that 450 years after the events. And then finally, we have probably the best ancient source, the writings of Arrian of Nicomedia, around about 150, about 500 years after the events. That's when they wrote. But we do not have their originals. What we have is copies of copies of copies of their originals, and we go to a wider time scale to see how long we have to wait to get manuscripts of these people. For Diodorus of Sicily, we have to wait more than 1,000 years, to about 1100 AD, before we have any copies of what he wrote. For Quintus Curtius, we don't have to wait quite so long. His documents are available from copies that were made in the 850s or early 900s. Plutarch, Life of Alexander, we do not have a copy of that until the 12s and the 1300s, more than 1100 years after Plutarch wrote, and Arrian, we have to wait 1100 and more years, oops, gone one too far, before we have manuscripts. So there's part one and part two of a historical problem. How long was it before the events that are described were written down in sources that still survive, and how long was it until we get copies of manuscripts which we can use? Now, apply exactly the same problem to Jesus and the Gospels. Jesus was born 7, 6, 5 years before Christ. I know, it's silly, but the reason, in a sentence, is that the 6th century monk who worked out the calendar got it wrong. It doesn't matter. Jesus lived to about 30 or 33 AD, and then 35 to 45 years later, one side or other of 70 AD, Mark's Gospel was written. Matthew and Luke, between 45 and 50 years later. We don't know which came first. And John's Gospel, maybe as much as 60 years later. We don't know precisely. That's why the colour blocks are a little bit vague at the edges. It's to say this is approximate. But now we go to the manuscript question, and I've shortened this bit, because for all of the Gospels, we have manuscripts starting at around about 350 AD. That's considerably earlier. Quick comparison. There's the same time scale. There are the arrows. But let's sum it up. On average, the time span between the lifetime of Alexander and when they were written down is greater than 400 years, and the time span between when they were written down and the earliest manuscripts we have available is greater than 1,000 years. For Jesus, the average time between the events and when they were written down is about 50 years, and the average time between that and when we have manuscripts is around about 300 years. That's the contrast. Now, I'm not saying in absolute terms we know about Jesus better than we know about Alexander. The situation is considerably more complex than that. But simply in terms of the narrative histories we have of what these people did, we are in many ways better off for Jesus on those two tests of history than we are for Alexander the Great. But hey, you can still study him at high school, and you can still do my course on him if you come up to Macquarie. Let's leave that and turn specifically to the question of the resurrection. My fourth claim is certainly controversial, and it has to do with how good the evidence for Jesus actually is. When we come to the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, it is my claim that the gospel accounts, though varied, show remarkably little elaboration in their reporting of the events of the first Easter. In my view, they resemble more honest, though sometimes confused reporting of remarkable events, rather than theological elaboration. Specific examples. The four gospel accounts do not neatly fit together. You cannot easily jigsaw them into one straightforward narrative. You can with a considerable degree of effort, but it's certainly not easy. And I think our learned friends, I think my learned friends, I've wanted to say that ever since I saw Rumpole. I think my learned friends would agree that if several witnesses agree too closely, one soon begins to suspect collaboration. It is clear that with the Gospels we are dealing with several pieces of at least partially independent testimony. There is very little reporting in the Gospels of things that nobody could have seen or known. There is one passage in Matthew's Gospel where there's a conspiracy between the chief priests and the Pharisees and Pilate, and I suspect that Matthew isn't telling us how he knows about that. And I suspect that's weak evidence. But apart from this, we only get reports of what particular individuals, usually particular named individuals, claim to have seen. More importantly, there is a striking lack of theological elaboration in the gospel accounts. We know quite a lot about what early Christians thought should accompany a resurrection, what kind of special effects a filmmaker would have to use to make a resurrection story work, because they talk about them when the early Christians talk about what they believe will happen at the final worldwide resurrection. There will be, according to 1 Thessalonians, the call of the archangel. There will be the last trumpet. That's in Matthew, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians. There will be the first fruits, a feature of Paul's exposition of 1 Corinthians 15. Possibly those who rise from the dead will shine like stars, as is suggested in the book of Daniel. But what's intriguing is, though the early Christians thought all these things were what happened at a resurrection, the gospel accounts do not report them as features of Jesus' resurrection. The most striking case, however, to me, is how they describe the date when Jesus was raised. Anyone who's ever been a churchgoer can recite the phrase, "On the third day he rose again in accordance with the scriptures." It's Paul's phrase from 1 Corinthians 15:4, and then it got taken up and plonked into the creeds, and pretty well every church recites the creed every week, so you've probably heard it somewhere. It's perhaps related to the promise in the book of Exodus that God would appear at Mount Sinai on the third day. It's certainly related to the prophecy in the book of Hosea chapter 6, where Hosea, talking about resurrection, says, "After 2 days the Lord will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him." This language is in the minds of the early Christians. It's probably also a feature of early Christian theology, which tied Jesus' death to Passover. And on the third day of Passover, the first fruits was consecrated in the temple. And Jesus' resurrection was the first fruits from the dead. In other words, the "on the third day" language is absolutely thick with theological meanings for the gospel writers. But you know, they don't use the phrase. If you read the 4 Gospels, you will find that none of them uses this "on the third day" language. They uniformly say, "on the day after the Sabbath." Now, my point is simple. Theological language for explaining what the resurrection was about was available to the early Christians. They could have used it, and they didn't. They simply reported a chronological marker. Was it on the third day? Of course it was. But they didn't build in that theological elaboration. They simply reported what they believed had happened and when. Now, my 5 and 6 claims I'm going to have to abbreviate. I knew I was going to take too long. History lecturers are used to 50 minutes, aren't we, Han? What can you do? So what I'll do is quickly make a claim which you can quiz me on later. First up, it is very hard to explain the rise of the belief in the resurrection of Jesus in the religious thought view of the Greco-Roman world. The belief that a human or divine figure might die and then rise to new life is not at all widespread in the ancient world. The belief in dying and rising gods, which was so much a part of Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough when it was first published in 1890, only 125 years ago, is now seriously out of date. Dying and rising gods simply aren't common in the ancient world. And to give you the best example, and I think it is the best, there's the Egyptian god Osiris. He's a dying and rising god. But, number one, he does not rise from the dead into the land of the living or to heaven. He rises from the dead in the land of the dead and becomes the king of the dead. He never returns to the land of the living. And Osiris dies and rises, mythically, every year. He dies when the spring is over, the summer has been, and the crops and the greenery are dying away. Osiris dies, and he rises again anew every spring, mythologically speaking. Whereas the claim about Jesus is that he died and rose under Pontius Pilate at one brief span in history, at a particular time and a particular place. 5-point summary. My claim, and we can deal with this in more detail, is that the historical evidence for the resurrection is, number one, earlier than most people realise. Number two, more consistent than most people realise. Number three, less embellished with theological development than most people realised. Number four, harder to explain in its cultural context than most people realise. And number five, simply more historically persuasive than most theories brought forward to explain it away. I'll have more to say later, but that will do for now.
Thank you very much indeed. The wonders of modern technology. We don't have that out at the little village of Malali where I live. But one never knows, you know, and perhaps a reflection of how rapidly the world is changing. On a philanthropic trip to Indonesia a while ago, I was asked by a businessman to go and speak at his church. He was a Christian Indonesian. So I said to him, "Have you asked your head pastor?" He said, "I am the head pastor." So anyway, I didn't see any way I could get out of it. So I went along to this church, magnificent, huge, purpose-built place. Very interesting in Muslim Indonesia. Anyway, it was a massive building, and it had what I was assured was the largest screen in the Southern Hemisphere. It was staggering. And to my horror, when I walked in and looked at this thing, I sort of realised just how awful it was. It had on one side their church's logo, which I think from memory was Christ Cathedral, the perfect church for imperfect people. Then had a picture of me, taken sometime when I was in public life, before I'd gone grey. And there was an Indonesian fellow who came up with me with an evil glint in his eye, looked at me, looked at the photograph, looked back at me and said, "Just how long ago was this photo taken?" But that wasn't the worst. Beside it, they had showing that, you know, lots of people are into spin. It's not just, the Australian advertising industry. In small writing, it had, and this is a massive screen, you know, the size of this wall plus some in length. It had, "We welcome our guest," and then in massive writing, "John Anderson." And then in the small print, you know that you're actually meant to miss, it had just two simple words, "Former Deputy," and then in massive writing, "Prime Minister of Australia." So there you go. But that is just on a lighter moment. Chris, thank you. We'll have the opportunity to thank you properly later, and you'll be cross-examined, and of course you will have opportunities for questions. I'm sure you're remembering that and keeping those in mind. You'll need to feed those in over the break time so that we can make sure we've got the questions that most reflect your greatest concerns. We'll take a line through them with integrity. But it's now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Han Balterson. Han is the Hughes Professor of Classics at the University of Adelaide. He was born in Holland. He's taught at Harvard Centre for Hellenic Studies and King's College London. He's been at the University of Adelaide since 2002, making wide-ranging contributions to teaching and research in classical studies and ancient thought. In 2011, Han was appointed to the Hughes Chair of Classics, one of the university's 3 foundation chairs. Han teaches courses such as Afterlife and the Underworld. I hope someone can invent a good question about that one. It sounds very interesting. Classical mythology. They tell me it's well attended.
It is.
And classical mythology and ancient medicine and its legacy. Han is passionate about connecting the past to the issues of contemporary society. As a lover of history, how wise can he be? The ability to bring the wisdom of the past, the great figures of the past, the great thinkers of the past to our dining room today so that we can discuss with them what has gone before us would be a great help if we were to be serious about identifying where we are and therefore where we might go in the future. So it's a great pleasure to have you, and I invite you now to take the podium.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was sort of added to this whole event on a slightly late notice, but I'm going to do my very best to counter some of the arguments that Chris so passionately and persuasively has set out. I want to thank Craig for bringing me on. It's already more interesting than I had ever hoped. And clearly, I will be taking a slightly more risky position in this debate by playing, so to speak, the devil's advocate. Now, let me remind you, that's just an expression. I have had no contact with the Prince of Darkness before I came here. But seriously, what we are aiming for here, of course, in the spirit of what John said earlier, is a fair and critical debate. My contribution comes from a strictly historical point of view, based on my expertise regarding the ancient cultures of Greece and Rome. In responding to my learned colleague, I will focus in particular on the evidence presented and its validity. Before I start, I would like to just make two short preliminary points. One concerning the method of such an investigation, and the other with regard to the importance of belief and religion. Historical methodology serves the purpose of setting out a framework for what are acceptable ways to collect and interpret historical evidence. Things we find in history may be called historical, but that does not mean that they are true. So we have to be very careful in using the word historical. By just claiming that something is historical, we can't claim it is true as well. History, and I think Chris would agree, is not an exact science, but it can reach levels of plausibility, higher or lower. And in presenting the case against resurrection, all I need to do, I think, is to cast reasonable doubt on the meaning of the evidence presented to weaken the opponent's case. Although I may try to do more than that, I submit that the contradictions and inconsistencies will actually help me to argue that kind of case. My second point relates to intention. Although I will try to cast doubt on the resurrection as a historical fact, this does not mean that I intend to cast dispersions on the importance that religion and belief can have for many. I see it as a flawed means to an end, which may inspire, unite, and drive people. But I think the issue here is that what we're talking about is the belief in belief. And that's a kind of issue that I will expand on in a moment. So I just prefer to stay away from the kind of beliefs which are, on balance, I think, fiction rather than fact. Now, as to the specific claims that Chris made, I will try to go through them in order as he presented them, although I'm not sure I can cover all of them because it's a very complex and a very elaborate sort of set of pieces of points that he made. The textual evidence and its early dates. I don't think I would dispute that 1 Corinthians is probably the earliest piece of evidence that we have talking about this notion of resurrection. But again, does early mean more true? It is natural in historical terms to actually try and get as close as one can go to the events that were presumably happening at some point. But I will tell you now, if I were to reject the fact that there is a resurrection, why would I believe something that is said about it 10 years later? That's an issue there. You can say the evidence is quite early, but it is just something that we have to take Paul's word for. So starting with 1 Corinthians and comparing with the Gospels, again, I have no particular criticism or rejection about to offer here. But the point that he's making is perhaps a little bit beside the issue. This is not just about resurrection, but about the belief in resurrection. His point is, well, it seems to be saying, is that the Corinthians were doubting a general resurrection, which is clearly some kind of strained reading. In logic, the claim that Paul is making, which is this, if the resurrection were not true, my preaching here would be pointless. And from that he infers that it can't be pointless and therefore we must be preaching the resurrection. Now, this is a kind of conditional hypothetical, as we sometimes call it, with very complicated terms. But conditional just means that there is a big if involved. He says, if this is not something we could say, then all the things that we say afterwards is probably pointless. You can't turn that argument around. So my point here is rather technical, but it tells us that if Paul were to argue that the resurrection is true simply on the argument that, well, if it's not, What are we doing here? That's rather a weak kind of argument. So it's not just a strong argument, it is simply a leap of faith to talk about it in such terms. The further point that was made about the dates of the later Gospels is something that I want to take up on one specific point. And I would really like to question Chris later on that particular point as well, when he was saying there's very little theological elaboration involved. I'm not 100% sure I understand what you mean there, so we'd like to clarify that later. But it seems to me that if one reads these particular Gospels, what is going on in the different versions that we read, and if we accept the chronology, which I probably do roughly, that Chris is offering us here, what we see is that there is embellishment going all the way through in the particular sequence that we can place them in time. So for instance, whilst in Mark we have a fairly short account where the three women arrive and there's one young man referred to as very special and looking kind of, glittering and shiny and white as snow, not called an angel, by the way, which of course in Greek simply means messenger. In the next version of Matthew, if this sequence stands up, what we find is a far more elaborate account. There is an angel from God, it is said. But then again, there's an earthquake. And the women and the guards are feeling fear about this appearance. And the guards are so fearful, they look like they're dead. They're described in terms that could also literally be translated as dead bodies, necroi. And the angel says, he's not here, he has awoken, just as he said. Now that's another kind of very interesting comment that I wanted to raise. It's always intrigued me that the language used there is one in terms of sleeping and awakening. So we know that in antiquity they would compare sleeping and death. That's a kind of obvious thing to do. In fact, in Greek mythology it was very obvious because they made the gods of sleep and the gods of dead brothers. And if you've ever observed someone sleeping in a very deep sleep, you might actually get a little worried sometimes. I know this from when I was a parent of very young children, the little babies that sleep very deeply, you sort of think, I have to go and poke it. That's the kind of small difference that you can sometimes observe. And there's a lot of language involved in this further version of the description of the resurrection, which involves words that concern seeing. So there's a lot of emphasis trying to give us an idea of what these people actually saw. But the trouble I have with that is that it's all too convenient. And the point that Chris also alerted to sort of started me thinking along lines of, look, if some of this language is actually trying to convince us just because of the language that's being used, then we should be a little bit more careful about what is actually being said, rather than just take it as, oh yes, these are eyewitnesses, so it must be true. If the ancients took that as given, that someone being a witness might actually tell you something that is true because they saw it, we would say, well look, subjective experience can be really misleading and deceptive. So what is it actually that they saw? The other thing is, much of the convenience lies in the way in which these Gospels try to make us see that what's happening there is actually fulfilling a prophecy from the Old Testament, from the Old Scriptures. And if you look at those particular details, it just turns out to be very much a perfect fit again and again and again. And so that you don't miss those particular similarities and even symmetries between the two scriptures, what they will tell you is, well, as it was foretold, or let's look at that particular book. So there was a number of examples that one could give in which this convenient match of prophecy and now fulfillment is absolutely underlined. And I think that's too good to be true. Now, the third point that Chris made is something to do with the quality of the historical writings that we use. And he had this sort of beautiful timeline, which, I mean, I'm very jealous of. I wish I could go to his course and see all that magic going on there, because unfortunately I didn't have time to prepare something like that. So you have to go with me unplugged. But anyway, what you could see there is a very strong argument that in historical terms, in historical circles, would be used to cast some doubt on the reliability of sources. Now, when I say some doubt, that is about handling sources responsibly and being aware that there might be an issue here and there. So the distances that you have between, say, when something was written compared to when things happened, or compared to when we actually have an actual manuscript, is in itself a reason for caution. But that doesn't really always affect, in every case that is something to be thought about, the way in which we should judge what these sources offer us in terms of their validity, in terms of their reliability. We actually have other examples where much later sources are more reliable than much earlier sources. So in that sense, this argument could go either way. I'm also not convinced that if you try to argue that certain relationships between the report and the event depend on how close they are to the event, you overlook one particular feature which is very crucial to the nature of the sources that lay at the origin of all these stories and deeds and sayings of the tradition of Christianity. Because it was an oral tradition. And I know that Chris has views on this. I had a peek of one of your presentations that were posted online. And I know that he really has some very interesting things to say, so this will come out in the debate. But the point I would make about this is that orality is a term for a society that doesn't write things down as a norm, that doesn't really, that isn't involved in making a point of putting everything on paper, or in this case, either on papyrus, or on a piece of leather, or on a piece of cloth, or whatever. What that means is that it is comparable to the culture that we know of jokes. If you tell a joke, you're not going to write it down and then go to your neighbor and say, hey, I know a good joke, look, and then I'm going to read it out to them. What you do is you try to memorize it, especially the punchline, folks, because that's important, and then you go and tell it to someone else. Now, what happens to the joke? Well, people who have studied this have observed that jokes that get retold and retold and retold is that they change. Now, there's a tricky thing going on there, because that doesn't mean that everything about the joke changes, and so in this case too. But it does mean that in a lot of detail, there is a major sort of degree of unreliability involved. So what we have then is a cluster of stories being told from different perspectives at different points in time in roughly, say, from 10 to 60 years after the event, in which we already have heard that these stories are, in many respects, highly inconsistent. Now, when there are some of these details which are really troubling students of these particular Gospels, then the question really becomes, and here is my reasonable doubt, the question really becomes, where do you draw the line? If they are unreliable in 10 details, when do you say the 11th is reliable or not? And that is the eternal doubt that has made me a skeptic. Now, the point that he came back to about little theological elaboration I've already covered. So what I want to finish up with is to make a comment on the point of the difficulty of explaining the rise of resurrection belief in the Greco-Roman world as a broader context. I admit, I agree, that this is not a common feature, the dying and rising God. And the real trouble we have here is that the case of Jesus Christ seems actually to be quite unique. If you scramble around across the world religions, you might actually find up to 10 examples of dying and rising gods. But they are never individuals that come down to earth, as it were. So that version of the story seems to be very unique in the claims made about Jesus. But in historical context, several elements of the belief in resurrection had always been competing in an open market of religions. Establishing a new faith required strong recruiting tactics. And I think that the early sect, led by Joshua, Jesus, needed something very special to have an edge over the competing religions that they found. Christianity seems to have decided to do it this way by a trump card argument, the resurrection. So whilst many religions offered, say, life after death, or had special prerogatives while you were part of their community, what they didn't have is someone who claimed to have been the Son of God, come down to earth, died for our sins, and gone back up again, and lived for a short period of time after his death amongst his followers. That seems to be something that is quite unique. And again, I read this as an argument that could both ways. You could either say, well, that makes this belief and this particular religion very special and worthy of following. But I say, it actually seems to me as if it's an argument that is trying to find that one special thing that could really attract people by offering something that the others didn't have. So the competing religions that we know of, even the competing preachers that we know of, or people who claim to be healers of some kind of special nature, would have to come up against something like that in order to beat them and to draw their believers away. There is actually a pagan case of a believer, of a preacher healer by the name of Apollonius. We're very unsure about his dates, but there were certain uncertainties in Chris's account as well. We think he lived in the 1st century, something a little later than Jesus, maybe in the second half. And according to some reports, people believed rather in him than in Jesus. So this clearly gives us a good example of competition between religions. We have a late biography. Here we get back to the problem of the sources that are late, talking about someone earlier on. But equal reasonable doubt is probably applicable in this case as well. Now, finally, the point of choosing to present this whole story and the beliefs involved in it in historical terms. Representing a belief in historical terms by itself, to me, does not make the claims more true. Historical documents do not guarantee a truthful story. As I said earlier, the Gospels are actually neither histories nor biographies. They may have a historical framing of sorts, and in some of the overlaps we may believe more about them and the way that they tell us something about that particular time, but many theologians would say, well, they're kind of a sociological document. They tell us something about what people thought about religion or how they would try to justify their religion. It doesn't tell us anything in solid proof about why we should believe that someone was rising from the dead or waking up from being dead. So in conclusion, I would hold that the evidence presented for the resurrection is rather weak and very unlikely to be based on so-called eyewitness accounts twice removed from the supposed event. If we were to believe that earlier and more consistent and more persuasive applies to these particular Gospels, what I put up against it is that we are dealing here with narratives or stories concocted out of scriptural sources, while the contradictions and inconsistencies of the Gospels overall suggest that much of what they offer is driven by religious zeal, which in the early days of the sect's existence were no doubt brought on by the pressures of the Roman Empire and the competitive nature of religious movements. Thanks for your patience.
Well, Han, thank you very much indeed for a very thought-provoking contribution. Enormous amount of scholarship's gone into both of these presentations, and I'd just like to say that I, for one, appreciate enormously not only the work that you've put into tonight, but the years of learning that stand behind them. We're going to break for 10 minutes. We'll then come back for the thrilling second half, cross-examination, your opportunities for questions. And I think you'll all agree we've made a tremendous start tonight. Again, thank you for your enormous civility and your good humour in what are very difficult debates for many of us, frankly. I think that's a fair thing to say. So a 10-minute break. Can we resume promptly to get on with the next bit?